So we're back at the overview screen of our storage account, and we can see here right on the overview screen that there are 4 types of data that the general purpose V2 storage that we created can store. The most common type is a blob, and that is stored in what's called containers. There is a file system, which is an SMB file share. That means that we can mount this from our Windows servers and from our Windows workstations or Linux. And so it's a shared file storage. There is a table storage format. It's not really a SQL Server database, but it does store data in columns and rows. And finally, there is the concept of queues, which is effectively a messaging system that has a first in, first out type of metaphor. Now we're going to focus on containers right now. If we go into it, now I have created a container called test. Actually, it's very easy to delete that container, and it's telling me that if I had locks or any other RBAC settings that I'm going to fail, I can attempt to override it, but I'm just going to delete the container and you'll see it successfully deleted. Creating a new container has this plus container button, and I'm going to call it new test. And we do get the chance of having private blob or container access. Private access does require the security keys that we were talking about, or a shared access signature. Blob and container access does allow anonymous access, so be very careful when selecting these two. Private is fine. Now, to store a file in a container, you go into the container. Now, look at this message. It says you do not have access. Now, this is very interesting because when we created the storage account, we set up a virtual network for it. So I'm going to go back up to the storage account level, and we're going to go into the firewalls and virtual network setting. And you can see we actually only selected virtual networks have access to the storage account. And so we could move this to all networks, and that would remove that error message. Or we could add our own computers to the firewall, which is what I'm going to do. So I check this checkbox saying add your client IP address. So now I'm whitelisted myself, including this virtual network plus myself, into the storage account. If I go back to overview, go back into containers, go back into new test, now we don't get the authorization error. So now we do have access because my IP has been whitelisted. Now from this point, we can upload files, but this is not a very good way. This container view is not a very good way of interacting with files. For instance, you wouldn't be able to preview the contents of a file, or it does become kind of hard to move stuff around. So there are better ways to do this. Let's go back to the containers view. Now, if I go into the overview, one of the first items in the top left corner says Open in Explorer. So we can go into what's called Storage Explorer. The same view is under Storage Explorer, and it's going to basically give us a different and maybe more efficient view of our storage account, including the containers. We just created this new test. And now we can sort of do filtering, we can do searching. There are more information available within Storage Explorer. Now, this browser view of the storage account isn't even the most efficient way. Microsoft provides a Windows, Mac, and Linux version of Storage Explorer software that you can download to your computer and manage your Azure storage accounts using this software. Now, all Azure services use what's called a REST API, and so you can programmatically add storage into your own custom code as well. So if you need to view and move and copy things into storage account, the REST API might be the most efficient, or this Windows download or Linux or Mac OS download might be more efficient when working with files. But we have this browser view, and it's quite convenient sometimes. So we created this new test container. Let's upload a file into it. So I'm going to say upload, and we're given this panel that says select a file. I can programmatically pick one. I'm going to pick one of the videos that I just recorded for this course. Now we open up the advanced section. We can see that there's a couple of ways to authenticate. We can authenticate using the access keys, or if we want to authenticate using an Azure Active Directory user, we'll talk about RBAC authentication in a couple of videos from now. We can do that. Now we do have the choice of a blob type. There are blocks, pages, and append blobs. Now block blobs is sort of the default, and for most situations it's going to be pretty good. Page blob type is sort of optimized for when you need to update the file, but not the entire file. So this will be good for a virtual hard disk or some type of piece of data that is updated but only partially. And finally, append blobs are optimized for adding to a file. So like a log file where you're just always appending to it. That's the ideal for that. So block blobs is going to be fine for 99% of the cases. You'll see here it says upload VHD files as page blobs. That really is the optimized case for page blobs. If we're interested, we can choose the block size. That really is not an important decision for most cases. You know, maybe you know your file system so well that 64 kilobyte or 128 kilobyte blocks are optimal because you've got a lot of really tiny files. Let's say you have hundreds of thousands of really tiny files. Maybe you do want to go to a smaller block size for efficiency, but if your files average around 4 megabytes or higher, then that's a pretty good size for that too. Remember, we talked previously about hot, cool, and archive tiers. Hot is the default. Archive is the cheapest of them all. So let's say hot costs 2 cents a gigabyte, cool costs 1 cent a gigabyte, and archive costs 1/10 of a cent a gigabyte. That type of relative cost per gigabyte. And finally, there is a virtualized folder metaphor. Let's just leave all of these with the defaults and say upload. So now the 24 megabyte file is going from my computer through my browser over the open internet and will end up into this new test. So in this video, we saw that there are many ways to access the contents of our storage account, including Storage Explorer, which is available in the browser as well as in separate software.